Thank you so much for joining this workshop today, everyone. It's so brilliant to see so many people interested in surveying oil beetles and solitary bees. So just to introduce myself, I'm Sally Morris. I work for Buglife as a conservation officer in Scotland as part of the Species on the Edge programme, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. Just some housekeeping things. Could I ask you to please mute your microphones during the workshop? Any questions as we're going, please just put them in the chat. And I'll get round to answering at the end of each session. So I'm planning on splitting this up into 2 sessions, just as we have quite a lot to cover. So we'll have a little break halfway through for a cup of tea, and I'll answer some questions halfway through and then at the end. So don't worry, there will be opportunities to ask questions. Just bear in mind, you will have heard, I think, when you join the workshop, I am recording this session just for people that can't make it. So if you don't want to be seen, just turn your camera off or anything. But to be honest, most of the recording will just be of the PowerPoint and then my voice over it. So yeah, we'll get started. Tell me if there's anything wrong in the slides with the chat, and I'll make sure we fix that. So firstly, I just wanted to introduce Buglife to anyone that doesn't know about us, haven't heard about the organisation. So we're the only organisation in Europe concerned with conservation of all invertebrates. And our aim is to halt invertebrate extinctions and achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates within the UK. We do this in a number of ways. So many of our projects are all about raising awareness of invertebrate species that need our help. So that's what Species on the Edge is all about. It's really talking about species that perhaps people haven't even considered or heard of or know about. We also carry out practical conservation work, such as we do peatland restoration work, so that's a photo of one of our sites. We also have staff working at a sort of higher level, trying to influence policy and lobby politicians to care about invertebrates. So we have a particular focus on pollinators, for example, with our bee lines projects, which you might have heard of, as well as freshwater invertebrates as well. So a lot of conservation work is put into sort of bigger, more visible, perhaps more palatable, I don't mean this literally, species such as those featured at the top of this pyramid. However, we have over 40,000 species of invertebrates within the UK. So that's that big blue base to the pyramid. And they fulfill really important ecological roles and provide a wide variety of essential services, such as those shown in my next slide. So recent studies paint a really grim picture of the decline of insects and other invertebrates across the planet. At current rates of decline, 41% of the world's insect species could be at risk of extinction over the next few decades. And a very small number of unfussy, very mobile and pollution tolerant species are able to cope with the damage that humans are doing to the planet. And these sort of generalist species are replacing the rich diversity of species that do make up the fabric of life on Earth. So there are lots of different things that are causing invertebrate decline, but they're particularly vulnerable to decline because they have more delicate, specialist and interdependent ecology than other organisms. Their habitats aren't properly protected. So while we might have triple SIs that are protected for, say, breeding waders or for botany purposes, we don't have that for invertebrates. And that's something that Buglife is actually currently working on with important invertebrate areas. They're very small, and so they often suffer worse from sort of habitat fragmentation and change. And our countryside is increasingly tidy and chemically controlled through pesticides and nitrates. So it's often quite hard to see the immediate impact that these things have had on insects, whereas it's a bit more obvious if you see, a decrease of birds, for example. So Buglife's response to this insects declines crisis is this no insect extinction sort of campaign, which gives a prescription for healing our planet by restoring depleted and devastated insect populations. And this means basically providing more space for wildlife, reconnecting our wild places. This land should be free of pollution, including light pollution that we're particularly working on at the moment, and protected from the impacts of climate change. So all of this is impossible without an increased understanding and awareness of invertebrates and their needs. So I'm sure many of you are aware of the state of nature reports that come out every few years. The latest report for Scotland includes some quite bleak statistics, such as nearly half of Scotland's species have declined in abundance since 1970. And this is due to habitat loss, climate change, pollution, disease and changes to land management, and they've all taken a toll on our native species. So we need sort of informed and coordinated action to tackle this biodiversity loss. And this is where Species on the Edge really comes in. The Species on the Edge is a new partnership programme that will take action to save 37 threatened species across Scotland's coasts and islands. So this is about sort of reversing declines, restoring their environment and ensuring their survival. So it's a 4-year programme which has mainly begun this year, so it'll run till 2027. And it's a partnership of 8 different conservation organisations. So one of these is Buglife. And we're funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as lots of other organisations that have all generously donated to make this work happen. So Species on the Edge has sort of 3 main aims. So the main thing is to improve the future of these 37 threatened species, but it's also about pushing forward species conservation, learning from shared knowledge and experience to combine our strengths, and creating a stronger collective future for Scotland's species. So we're working on raising the profile of our target species, creating safe havens, and reinforcing the connection between people and nature. So these are the project areas that we've got within Species on the Edge. So you see that there is a real focus on Scottish coasts and islands, and I work particularly in Argyll and the Inner Hebrides, and I also do some work in the Outer Hebrides as well. And each area has a unique plan of action reflecting their mix of species, biodiversity, geography, and cultural challenges of the area. So it's a very complicated project. Here is a massive table that tells you that. But basically, Species on the Edge has a variety of different projects within it that usually work on sort of a group of species each. So to make it simple, we'll just focus on Buglife's project, which is invertebrates on the edge. It's just looking at 5 species, and I actually work on 2 of those, so medicinal leech, short-necked oil beetle, and northern coletes, hence this workshop. So here are our species, and to best support them, we're looking at learning more about their needs. And one route to this is an increased survey effort, so we have more information about their distribution, abundance, habitat, and feeding habits. So now we can move on to oil beetles, which is hopefully why you're here. So the family is Meloidae, so there's 11 species within that, and 8 species of true oil beetle. And we have 5 of these in the UK, including black, violet, short-necked, rugged, and Mediterranean. And these are sort of large black beetles, at least for the UK, and they have this waistcoat. So it looks like they're wearing a sort of waistcoat that's a bit too small for them, as their wing cases don't extend to the end of their abdomen. But why am I asking you to survey oil beetles? Why are you interested in surveying oil beetles? Well, basically, oil beetles are nest parasites of solitary mining bees. And these bees need flower-rich habitats to survive. And these habitats have been lost all over the UK in recent years. And so when the bees decline, the oil beetles just disappear, as they're the parasites. So in this way, oil beetles are quite a good indicator of the health of our countryside. And so the more that we know about their distribution, almost the more we know about how our countryside is doing. So Buglife has actually been raising awareness of oil beetles for a number of years now. With citizen science surveys, they often doubled the records that were currently available. And the more that we know about them, it can better inform our conservation work. So knowing their habitat and food requirements will help us to protect them better in the future. And this increased awareness of oil beetles has actually led to more oil beetle species, once thought extinct, being seen in the UK. So why are oil beetles even called oil beetles in the first place? So when they respond to threats, so if you scare an oil beetle, like this person has in this photo, clearly, they secrete this foul-tasting, oil-like substance from their knee joints. And some southern European oil beetle species secrete really quite strong oils, which can cause the skin to blister. So in the US, they're known as blister beetles, which you might have heard of. Our UK species aren't like that. They might irritate your skin if you're particularly sensitive. But what you have to do is not scare them, so it's not too hard. And within this sort of fluid that comes from their joints contains a substance called cantharidin, and actually traditionally ground up oil beetles and some of their relatives that also have this same fluid. They were actually used in medicine, both externally and internally. And as cantharidin is quite a potent poison, internally, accidental poisonings were actually really common. So it's quite good we don't use them nowadays. So cantharidin, despite being a poison, can actually be quite attractive to other species. So certain species of biting midge are actually attracted to cantharidin and suck the oil beetles like body fluids in order to incorporate it into their own tissues so that they're protected from predators. So that oil beetle on the left isn't getting eaten by midges. Whilst it looks very uncomfortable, it's just getting sort of licked about with the midges for both their protection, really. And in continental Europe, male cardinal beetles, so that's a cardinal beetle on the back of a violet oil beetle on the right, they've actually been observed killing and eating resident smaller oil beetle species in order to take their cantharidin. So that photo shows a violet oil beetle, which is actually quite big, so about 3 centimeters in size. So they don't really bother, can't kill something so big. So in that case, they generally just lick or bite the oil beetle in order to get the cantharidin. So male cardinal beetles have this special gland on their head, and this allows females to check how much cantharidin the male has managed to accumulate before mating. And the cantharidin is passed to the female in the male's sperm during mating and is transferred to her eggs, which protects from fungi and predation. So females really only mate with cardinal beetles with a really significant amount of cantharidin in their body. So it's very interesting. All oil beetles have quite a similar life cycle. The UK's ones have slightly different timings, but we're going to go with the black and violet oil beetle timings. So the adults emerge in the spring, so usually around March time or April up in Scotland if things are a little bit later. And they feed up on soft grasses and herbs like lesser celandine. And when the adults first come to the surface, their abdomens are very, very small and they don't really protrude from the wing cases. So they don't really have that typical waistcoat look. But after a few days of quite a lot of feeding, they grow into their sort of more normal shape of waistcoat and then a huge abdomen. But it does take some days for them to fill out. So it can be a bit of a confusing time for identification. So lesser celandine is a particular favourite for this time, but they do eat a wide range of other plants, including buttercups, grasses, clovers. So once they've fed up, the males and the females, they find each other and a brief courtship follows. The male black and violet oil beetles have these sorts of elbows on their antennae. So you can see the male oil beetle who's and that beetle on top has these really sharp angles in his antennae, and they use them to grasp the female's antennae and rub them during courtship. Short-necked oil beetles don't have these; they have these sort of straight, shorter antennae. So as a compromise, the male sort of lightly drum on the female's head during their courtship, which apparently is very appealing to the females. Following their brief courtship, mating occurs. So there's a photo of 2 oil beetles mating. If you ever find them in that position, you know what's happening. Once mated, the pair actually remain together, often for over an hour, during which the male is often dragged along behind the female wherever she goes, which can't be very comfortable. After mating, the female digs a short burrow into the soil. And she can lay about 1,000 eggs in one burrow. And then she covers the entrance with soil. So in her lifetime, which is only a matter of months, a female black oil beetle may lay up to 40,000 eggs. So it's an absolutely huge number. And their eggs also contain cantharidin that I was talking about earlier to protect them from predation. So later in the year, these eggs hatch and these tiny little larvae appear. So here's a photo of some of them. They're called triangulans, and that's named after their hook-like feet. So tri means 3, and then ungula is Latin for claw. So they've got 3 little claws on each foot. And the goal of each triangulan is to gain access to a nest burrow of a mining bee. As I said before, they're nest parasites. So they climb up flower stems and they sit on the flower and they wait for an unsuspecting bee to visit. So here you can see a bee that's got some triangulans on its back, and there's a diagram of the 3 little claws on their feet. And the poor bee gains some hitchhikers when it goes and visits a flower with triangulans on it. So you can see here a bee that has been absolutely inundated in triangulans, which is very unfortunate. But if the bee flies off with a triangulan and carries it to its burrow, then it will feed on the nectar and pollen within the burrow, and it'll actually pupate in there. So triangulans are quite sort of louse-like in appearance, and it confused scientists for some time. But in the 1800s, which is bizarrely early, I think, they worked out the life cycle of the oil beetle. But to this day, there's still so much that we don't understand and that we're investigating, and we don't know the full range of potential host bees utilised by each oil beetle species either. You can actually find triangulans on other species that have no way of hosting them or taking them back to a burrow of which they can actually benefit from. So once on a flower, triangulans actually cling to any passing insect that might be feeding on the flower or just walking by. It's not a completely pointless exercise. So if a triangulan dismounts a flower away from its siblings, so hops on one bee and the bee goes to another flower and it hops off, it's actually more likely to encounter a bee that is not carrying another triangulan, so it doesn't have that competition. If it clings to a male bee of a compatible species, the triangulan can move across to the female during mating. And actually, if it attaches itself to a kleptoparasitic species of bee, so that's a bee that also is a nest parasite of other species, if it goes over to a nest to lay their egg in a fully stocked bee's nest, the triangulan will have a head start over the unhatched young of that parasite, and so may be able to secure the nest for itself. But due to all these quite unlikely factors, only 1 in 10,000 triangulans make it. So it's quite unlikely the triangulan will survive regardless due to weather conditions or being eaten. It's got to get on the right bee at the right time or get on the right journey at the right time. And then it's got to get to a burrow that's sufficiently stocked to ensure its survival. So it is all very unlikely. So if you see an oil beetle, you can be sure that it really fought its way to adulthood. So now we'll move on to the oil beetles we've got in Scotland. Until recently, only 2 species of oil beetle were found in Scotland. The violet oil beetle, that's on the left, and the short-necked oil beetle on the right. However, we've got a new contender now, which is the black oil beetle. So we do have historical records of black oil beetle in Scotland. However, a number of recent records were subject to misidentification due to being based on triangulan colour. So it was once thought that violet oil beetle larvae were black and black oil beetle larvae were yellow, and they're both sort of similar sizes. So they said these records said, oh, they're yellow larvae, therefore they're black oil beetles. But actually, it's been found that a yellow colour variation of violet oil beetle larvae exist in Scotland. So a lot of these records were scrapped. And due to this confusion, the presence of black oil beetles in Scotland hasn't really been certain. But this year, there's been a few definitely correct records to be sent in the sort of Highland area. So that's absolutely brilliant. I'm sure there are other records for black oil beetle in Scotland. We just need to go out and find them. But violet are a lot more common. So I'll talk about violet oil beetle first. So all of our oil beetles within Scotland are daytime spring active beetles. So they're out from March till June, usually more April to June within Scotland. Violet oil beetle is found in meadows and woodland edges, They're more frequently found inland, but that isn't a go fast rule. They're really quite large, up to 3 centimeters in length, and they've got a square-shaped thorax with the males having these kinked antennae. So you can see on the right, the really kinked antennae is the male. The female still slightly kinked, but not so aggressive. So here's a map of violet oil beetles in records within Scotland. You can see that they really are quite widespread and quite common, but that doesn't mean necessarily we've got thousands and thousands of records. So we always want more, and we always need to find out a bit more about each oil beetle species. So don't be disheartened if you only find a violet oil beetle while out and about. We'll go on to black oil beetles, who are very, very similar to violet oil beetles. They're still daytime and spring active. They're the same size. They've still got the square-shaped thorax. They've still got the kinked antennae. They're found in slightly different habitats, but still meadows and coastal grassland. So they can overlap, and it's really important to get the right photos of these to be able to tell them apart. But we'll go into that just a little bit later. So you can see we have very few records of black oil beetle in Scotland, and that one that I've highlighted is the only recent record left on the NBN Atlas after all the cases of misidentification. So that one's actually recent, but all the other ones are from 1947 or earlier. But please note there is a lag on data that comes through to NBN Atlas, as the records have to be verified and shared with the data recorder before appearing on the map. So all these records are a little bit out of date. So don't look at them and go, oh, but I found one there and it's not there. Don't worry, it will appear in time. So here we can look at the actual differences between black and violet oil beetles. And basically it's all about the thorax, or the prothorax, which is that section just behind the head. So you see that a black oil beetle has a straight base to the thorax, and they haven't got, they've just got, the wing cases are uninterrupted. Whereas if you look at a violet oil beetle, they've got this concave base to the thorax. They've actually got a sort of depression or indented area at the bottom that I'll show you in the next slide. And they've got this sort of tooth-like structure at the top of the wing case. So what does that look like in real life? So here's a really great comparison of the species, clearly showing that sort of straight base to the thorax in the black oil beetle. You see there's that sort of absence of a tooth within the black oil beetle. And here we've got the concave base to the violet, that little tooth that you can see there, and this depressed area. I do think this depressed area can be the most useful part of the identification process, as different angles can make the thorax look straight or concave. That little tooth is so hard to see unless you're directly above the beetle. But these are the features we look for when verifying records. So if you are getting any photos, really try and get a top-down view of the beetle. Otherwise, it's really difficult to tell the difference. So short-necked oil beetles are the easiest to identify, I'd say, thankfully, which is great that I'm working on them. They're really easy. So this species was actually missing in action from 1948, but it was rediscovered in Devon in 2006 and rediscovered in Scotland on the Isle of Coll in 2009. So it's up and coming for as our oil beetles go. It's also a daytime spring active oil beetle, but this one's found in sort of flower-rich Mecca grasslands within the Hebrides, sort of sand dune and coastal habitat. It's a little bit smaller, up to 24 mil in length, but it's got a rectangular shaped thorax. So that's the main sort of difference here. So you see that it's wider than it is long. It isn't square like the black and violet oil beetles. They've also got different antennae. So they've got short and straight antennae that are clubbed and they thicken towards the tip. And the male and females don't have a difference in antennae either, like the other species. So here's this map. This map's actually quite out of date. The current sites for short-necked oil beetles in Scotland are on Uist, Barra, Coll, Tiree and Isla, but we're finding new sites all the time. So I'm sure that whatever map I put will be out of date in any talk that I do. We do have two other species of oil beetle within the UK, which I'll just quickly mention. So this is rugged and Mediterranean oil beetle. They're both about 2 centimetres long. Mediterranean can be bigger, but in Britain it is usually about 2 centimetres. And they're found on chalk and limestone grasslands and coastal grasslands. But they're very similar to black and violet oil beetles. They're incredibly hard to tell the difference between them. They are autumn and winter active, which is the main difference from our other species. They're largely nocturnal, so if you want to go survey them, it's best that you go off in the night. They do have a rectangular shaped thorax like short-necked oil beetle and straight antennae, but the main sort of difference that's quite obvious is their coloration. So the other species that I've mentioned are all sort of this blue-black. They're very shiny, and these species are sort of dull black with a very roughened surface. Rugged oil beetles found in central and southern England and Wales. Mediterranean was actually missing in action for over 100 years and was only rediscovered in 2012 in southern England, so that's quite exciting. So here's the main difference when we're IDing them. So as you can see, they're super similar species. The difference is that rugged oil beetles have this distinct narrow groove in the middle of their thorax. So if you're in England and Wales for any reason, do keep an eye out for these two, or go out in the night specifically to look for them if you're that keen. So moving on to the beetle larvae, the violet and black oil beetle triangulans are the biggest, coming in at a mighty 2.5 mil or 1.5 mil. So these are absolutely tiny little things. And as I mentioned earlier, you can see that there's 2 colour variations to the violet oil beetle on the left. So they were thought to be black, but we've got this yellow colour variation in Scotland. Brevicollis, which is short-necked oil beetle near the end, that is only 0.5 millimetres long. So these are really, really tiny, quite hard to see. This is the sort of thing you'd see when you're out and about. So you might see a colourful flower with a few sort of black blobs on it. And they'd be triangulans. So do bear in mind the scale. I know we find it very hard to visualise sort of millimetre long things, but you know, these flowers are only a few centimetres wide. So it is visible to the naked eye, but not necessarily that it's a moving beetle larvae. We do have other UK oil beetles, or we used to. These are all thought to be extinct. They haven't been seen for some time. The most recent record we have is from the southeast of England from the early 1900s. It'd be absolutely amazing if we did find one of these. It's happened before, it can happen again. And they are still found in continental Europe. There are a few lookalike species, but thankfully oil beetles are quite distinctive, but they can sometimes be mistaken for other species like these. So we've got bloody nose beetle in the top left, devil's coach horse in the bottom left, and especially when devil's coach horse isn't in that sort of aggressive position with its scorpion-like tail, you can sort of see that it's a sort of long, big black beetle, and there can be some confusion. And then if you're out walking out and about and you see a big beetle running across a footpath, it could well be a violet ground beetle, not an oil beetle. Still beautiful things. I actually think the most likely lookalike species is this species of leaf beetle. So you can see that the wing cases are shortened like in an oil beetle, and they've got that sort of long abdomen. And especially when these are very gravid, gravid meaning pregnant, they can look a lot like an oil beetle. So just bear in mind that when you're out and about. I think I might just stop there for the first half of this talk, and we'll go on to solitary bees next. But any questions you have about just oil beetles, please let me know. Any questions, put in the chat. But I think I will just go and make myself a cup of tea. And if you want to stew on oil beetle questions, please do. And then I'll come back and we'll talk a bit about solitary bees, and we'll talk about surveying and recording, and what you can do for oil beetles. So I hope that's okay with everyone. We'll sort of come back in at 7:10, perhaps, if that works for everyone. That's in 8 minutes. So I'll just stop my video and mute myself, and you go put the kettle on. Right, everyone, we'll get back started. I hope everyone's managed to get themselves a nice cup of tea. or whatever you drink. Just had a look in the chat for the questions. Thank you for sending those in. So we've got one that says, were the 3 extinct species ever recorded in Scotland or just southern England? I'm afraid I'm not very knowledgeable about those species. I wouldn't be surprised if it was just in England or Wales, just because if they're in Europe, they may well have habitat or climate requirements that are better suited to South England and Wales. I think that's why we tend to have less species in Scotland. But I'm sure if you look on NBN Atlas, and if you search the species like Mellow, if you look at the genus Mellow, then I'm sure those records will come up. I might look this up after that and actually just put answers to questions I don't know about in a sort of resources pack that I'll send around at the end of this talk. I know someone said, will we get a copy of the presentation? I can absolutely do that when I send around these resources at the end of the talk. Simon saying that he was looking at out for some colites this morning. We have many sites on UIST, but so far I've not come across the beetle. What's the best time of day for finding or observing them? So on UIST, there's only one site in Balranald township in the North UIST. There is a record from South UIST. Whilst it's been accepted, I'm not certain about that. The habitat just doesn't seem right at all. So if you're not coming across them, it's likely that they're just not there. But the best time of day, I'm still actually finding that out myself for short-necked oil beetle. I do think there can be a time of day that perhaps is too hot for them and they're less active or they're less visible, so you don't come across them. I know that I was speaking to someone on Barra a few days ago and they seemed to think that late afternoon was the best time. I've had great success sort of late morning to midday, and then in the later afternoon they've been a bit more sluggish. I think it really depends on the temperature and specifically the ground temperature of the site. And this is something that we'll look into with Species on the Edge. But while this project was being developed, we only knew of that site, the sites on Coll within Scotland. So we're finding out so much more about short-necked oil beetle within Scotland, what it requires, and particularly for surveys. I know next year when I've got a bit more time, I am going to be doing surveys at particular sites at every hour or separate time intervals to try and work this out. So what's the best time of day for finding them? Hopefully we'll know if you are submitting records. It'd be great to know when you've found them, what time of day, just to have a bit more data on it. But don't worry if you don't find any on UIST. I was there last week and found some new ones, but not too far from the original Balranald site. And then found some in Barra that we already knew about anyway. Okay, so the next question is, Andrea says, is there anything else that looks like triangulans? I think I might have photographed some recently. I think other beetle larvae can look similar, and other larvae of just other species. I think it really depends if you're looking under a hand lens. You know, they've got the sort of louse-like appearance, which I don't think is that unusual within nature. But I think you'd have to look under a hand lens to see the detail of the triangulans and their little hooked feet. I don't think that would be visible unless under a hand lens. So I'm afraid I can't really say. It depends on your quality of photographs. Please feel free to send them over to me when I send around an email later on. But yeah, I'm afraid it's really hard to say. Next question comes from Susan. She says, do the oil beetle larvae stay in one bee egg cell or eat through many? It's thought they just stay in one. I think if they'll eat through the nectar and the pollen and even the eggs in the one nest burrow. I think if the burrow is not sufficiently stocked, I suppose, I think the triangular just doesn't make it because I'm not sure they've got any sort of digging power to get through to another burrow, if that seems to make sense. Like within a nesting aggregation, you've got to think of how small the triangulin is. So I think it does need to sort of pupate into an adult to get out. Fran says, I'm seeing the slides out of sync with the talking. 3 or 4 slides ahead. Oh, that's a shame. If anyone else is having the same problem as Fran, then please put that in the chat. If I'm 3 or 4 slides ahead of ones I'm talking about. I'm sorry that that's an issue with the technology. Okay. Do you know of any studies that have looked into what host bees they can use? We assume the black oil beetles on site we manage use ashy mining bees as they emerge at a similar time, but would be so interesting to investigate further. Yeah, so I'll go into this a little bit. I mean, you can see the slide. There's so much we don't know about oil beetles, and it's so hard in lots of these habitats where we're finding oil beetles. There are many different solitary bees nesting, and it's really hard to work out what host bees there are, because in theory, they're not fussy. We don't know that, but I don't see a reason why they should be that fussy. But even if you find a triangulate on a bee while surveying, that doesn't mean that that bee is a host species of the oil beetle. It just means that a triangulate is latched onto a bee. So there's an awful lot of work going into trying to find out the specific host species. The only host species that we definitely know about is short-necked oil beetle. Has the host species of Northern Caletes, at least within Scotland, but likely not elsewhere in the UK. But we are looking into this. I think it's the sort of work that either we need quite a lot of funding thrown into, or we need a mass amount of people looking into oil beetles and host bees and observing them for quite a long time. I wouldn't be surprised if ashy mining bees were a host. I wouldn't be surprised if oil beetles have different hosts in different areas, multiple hosts, one host. It's just really something that we don't know, but we want to know much more about. Natalie says, in England, our beetles are active early mornings and twilight. See, that's very interesting. Because I've definitely found different in Scotland. I think it depends so much on the site. I'm going to look into getting a sort of temperature probe for ground temperature for my future surveying, because I think a lot of our sort of areas that we have, at least within Scotland, are sort of big light traps, and they're so hot, and they must be much hotter than the air temperature, and I wonder if that affects when they're active. Dan says, do they use their wings for anything? Not at all. I don't think so. I mean, you can see proportionally they look a bit off, so they are flightless. I'm not really sure that they use them for anything, but they certainly don't use them for flight. And Natalie says, are there any foreign plant or flower species that may be toxic to UK beetles? That's quite a general question that I don't feel. Yes, I'm sure is the answer. I'm sure there are non-native species that are toxic to UK beetles. I'm not sure what they are, and I imagine it varies massively within each beetle species or family. So I'm afraid I can't really give you a satisfactory answer to that question. But I imagine it is the case. But I think lots of things in nature only they know what they can eat and what they don't eat. They don't tend to go and eat something and then immediately immediately are harmful. So, and she's also Natalie's just said, time of year does vary, the beetles being spotted, especially since climate change has impacted the UK weather. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I know that lots of people say for oil beetles, May is the peak. Talking to lots of people, at least in Scotland here, lots of people say that late April might be the peak, which is interesting. I think it massively varies. I know a lot of these, some short-necked oil beetles are in the Hebrides, at least within Scotland. And the Hebrides had such a sort of wet, cold year last year, and then this year is really, really dry, but to the point that it is affecting the flora. These flower-rich habitats are a bit like stunted as such, because we've had such a dry, sort of hot spring, summer so far. So no doubt that also impacts on the beetles and their feeding. Right, I think we've covered all the questions in the chat now. Let me know if I've missed anything. Yeah. I assume, Simon, you haven't seen any colites on Uist, even though you've been looking, because I was on Uist last week, but I think, well, I'd be interested if you have seen any, basically.
Yeah,
I didn't see any.
I've seen lots today.
Oh, really?
Amazing. Yeah, down at Howmore. In fact, if you can see my camera, my background photo has one of the photos from this afternoon.
Wow. So is that Colites floralis or succinctus, or do you know?
Floralis at this time of year. Yeah.
Yeah.
They just started coming out over the last couple of weeks.
Oh, brilliant.
I
must have just been unfortunate then.
Well,
I was hoping the weather was good enough.
They're certainly around at Howmore, and I've seen them down at Stony Bridge as well.
Brilliant.
There are lots of colonies up and down the Uist coast.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of time before short-necked oil beetles move down Uist. Not quite sure how they got to Barra so early. So they've been in Barra since 2021, but Uist.
There's a big colony of colites on Fujay, which is one of the small islands between Barra and South Uist. So possibly that's the sort of jumping off point. But it's interesting how they move along.
I know. I think they'll make it, but I also know that sometimes it seems to take longer than you think, because Cole's had them for ages, but Tyree, you know, short-necked oil beetles on Tyree were only found this year, and it's not like people weren't looking. So it is a bit unusual, their movement, perhaps.
I think probably quite a lot of these things are really quite under-recorded. I know one of my favorite species, some of the little bugs you find around stone ruins, you know, they're just virtually no records on NBN.
Yeah, I think lots of people also they might see them and go, oh, that's interesting, and they'll tell a few people, but they don't necessarily share the data, or the data just doesn't get onto NBN because of license issues. And yeah, there's all sorts of things that we should do to improve data sharing amongst like naturalists, but also just the general public. Because if people don't know that they're in their area, then they don't necessarily care about the species around them. But I do think, yeah, there's some of the sites I've gone to for short-necked oil beetle this year, you know, on what I would consider a really nice area of habitat. I found sort of 2 on a beautiful sunny day, and you sort of think, well, maybe it's just there are little small populations. The chance of an oil beetle larvae getting to a nest burrow and making it to adulthood is very small. And I think sometimes the sites vary year to year. The colites move on to different sites, so the habitats are a bit more, the sites are a bit more transient, I guess. So
yeah, I think colites certainly seems to be well established here.
Yeah,
I know there's a lot of trouble. People thought, oh, they've all been killed in the big storm we had in 2005, but no, they're the whole way up the coast. You're likely to find them.
It's whole west of the Uist. Well, yeah, I think it's only a matter of time. Keep looking. Someone's just said in the chat, does anyone add iNaturalist observations to NBN? I'm fairly sure, yes, that all gets connected. Same with iRecord data. Anyway, we'll move on to the rest of the presentation now. Thank you very much for questions. Please, if you think of more, just put them in the chat. That's absolutely fine. So next we'll just go on to solitary bees. This section is quite a lot smaller than oil beetles, but only because it could just go on for hours and hours and hours. So as we've been discussing, oil beetles are nest parasites of solitary mining bees, but the specific hosts of these oil beetles are largely unknown. Potential hosts could include pretty much any solitary bee you can think of that's in the same habitat. Including, yeah, ashy mining bees or other colites species. So northern colites is the only host host bee species that we know about, and it's a host for short-necked oil beetles within Scotland. There are likely other hosts. I don't want to dumb down this message too much and say this is the host, but it is one of them in Scotland, and it's a very sort of neat, nice-looking bee, medium-sized, 8 to 15 millimeters in length. Flight season is June till August, so they should be out now. And they've got these fox-coloured hairs on the upper side of the thorax and head, and a black abdomen with sort of narrow white or pale grey bands on each segment. And within Scotland, they're found in sort of coastal areas, sand dune habitat or flower-rich mecca grassland. And they feed on a wide variety of flowering plants as well. So actually the Northern Cletes is also found in Ireland. So it's the only bee species that's more abundant in Ireland than Britain. So yeah, there's lots of records of short-necked oil beetle or Northern Cletes that don't seem to sort of line up. And the Cletes species are very similar and difficult to ID in the field. So just because you see a bee that looks like this, do not think it's a Northern Cletes. It's likely a Cletes, but in the field that's really hard to ID. So here's a map that sort of shows so these are Northern Cletes records in blue. This is from NBN Atlas as well, so it doesn't contain all the data, of course, and short-necked oil beetle records in red. So you can see the correlation between the two species in the Hebrides. Remember that both these species are in Colin-Tyree and Islay, even though this map doesn't show that. But there's very little correlation outside of Scotland. Perhaps we just haven't recorded enough, and maybe Northern Cletes is down there, but it has got quite a northern range. And it's likely that the short-necked oil beetles in Devon and Wales do have a different host species. So we'll go on to talk about surveying. So for oil beetles, at least our Scottish species, go out March till June or early July. As I've said before, this is often sort of April time that March, the weather seems to be really good enough in Scotland for them to be out and about. And then for mining bees, it really depends on the species, but anywhere from April to August. Obviously, that flight season has got to coincide with the oil beetle season of March to June and the timings of the triangulans hatching out and things, because you know the bees have to be flying for the triangulans to be able to latch onto them and get into their burrows. So Northern Cletes flight season, as I've said, is June to August, and a lot of species are quite similar. Preferably go out on warm sunny days. That is when you're most likely to see these species, especially bees. I think the oil beetles are less fussy. I think you'll see them in lower numbers on more unpleasant days, but they are still there. I've been out on Islay in the pouring rain and still found short-necked oil beetles. So it is possible, don't let it put you off. But I understand if you'd rather, walk around a nice habitat on a warm sunny day, that completely makes sense. So for surveying, at least for oil beetles, for the larvae, you can either sweep wildflowers with a net, preferably white, just so that the larvae show up near solitary bee nest aggregations. So don't just sweep any wildflowers. You're really unlikely to get oil beetles from that. So do target your search. You can check flower heads to see if any triangulans are sort of sat atop them, and examine any solitary bees for triangulans. So to do that, you would have to pot the bee and likely use some sort of like lens to look at them. The flower heads, I've heard that sometimes the triangulans sort of seem to hide a bit in the flower and the petals. So if there's some sort of disturbance in the flower, they'll come out of hiding because they think there'll be something to latch onto that can fly it somewhere nice. So if you sort of poke a flower with a pencil or with your finger, the triangulans might appear. So that's also a method you can use. For adult oil beetles, it's essentially going for a nice walk, looking at the floor, which is really great for me, seeing as I do this quite a lot. So search areas of suitable habitat. So this is bare ground it has to have bare ground and lots of wildflowers. Oil beetles are quite often seen walking across footpaths just because they're really obvious then. and any exposed sunny banks where nesting burrows occur. So that's including solitary bee nests as well as the oil beetles' nests. And I've had most success with south or west facing slopes, but I wouldn't say that they can't be on anything else. I have found adults on north facing slopes, but I like to think they walked there. But who can say? We don't know. There's not enough data. So the more that we find out about this, the better. You can do more sort of targeted searches for the adults when they're not so active. You can often find them sort of curled up in vegetation. So you can search around their common food plants. So lesser celandine or buttercups or clovers. So surveying solitary bees, it is similar. Look on flowers, you can sweep vegetation for bees. Please be careful when using a net if you're capturing sort of pollinators, especially stinging pollinators, as they can get quite distressed and it can be quite hard to pot a bee from a net unless you've had a decent amount of practice. Look for them on any sort of bare ground or sandy banks, look for holes, looks for any sort of action going on there and buzzing. And bees will probably need to be potted for identification. It's incredibly unlikely they're going to sit still long enough for you to ID them, and you'll have to be super knowledgeable, which I know I certainly am not. There's too many solitary bees out there. So these are some typical oil beetle habitats. So on the left-hand side, we've got a coastal clifftop grassland. So top left is black oil beetle site. And then bottom left is a woodland ride with lots of lesser celandine. So that's a violet oil beetle site. And then on the right, we've actually got short-necked oil beetle sites. So they vary massively, actually, and there's still quite a lot to be looked into here. So top right is a short-necked oil beetle site in South Devon. So you see there is bare ground, there's also lots of gorse, and it's a sort of a very different grassland to the one below it, which is one of my sites on Isla. And they've got this sort of semi-fixed, sort of terraced amphitheatre-like look in these coastal sand dunes on Isla. So they are very different. And so if you do have the time when recording, note down the habitat features as well. Just we're still learning whether they're fussy or not, or what they need. The more we know about their habitat needs, the better we can protect them and help sort of inform land management advice about, for them. So surveying equipment, I'm actually of the opinion for oil beetle adults, you need absolutely nothing. You need to be able to get to site, of course, go to the right habitats, but they're not very quick. You just need to have some eyes and look at the floor. They're pretty big. And as I said, they are sort of easy to ID if you get the right view of them. So if you get that sort of top-down view, they are quite easy to ID. But if you're quite into surveying and have the sort of the funds to do so, you can get other equipment. So butterfly nets in particular for bees, quite hard to get hold of a bee without a butterfly net, or a sweep net, but butterfly nets tend to be better for bees. A hand lens to look at triangulans or solitary bees. Solitary bees tend to be very small, so that often helps when IDing them, for looking at their hairs and the like, and also looking for triangulans on them. And then any sort of pots that you could put in, mainly a bee really, to have a closer look at. Identification is very difficult when you've got a time limit. So if you pot them, you have a better chance. I would say just be really careful potting bees on warm sunny days. It does get really hot in there for the bee and it can be really harmful for them. So just make sure they're in the shade and they're potted for the least amount of time possible, as it does sort of have a greenhouse effect. So when you're out and about and you find an oil beetle or a solitary bee, say an ashy mining bee or a northern cletes, it's really important to record what you find. So many people, including myself, have a whole selection of photos on their phone or on their computer or on notes down somewhere that I haven't done anything with. But it's incredibly hard to inform conservation work without the full data. And the more data we have, the better chance we have at working to help these species. So we can record through iRecord, or someone's mentioned iNaturalist. And there are other sort of biological recording services. So iRecord, for anyone that doesn't know, It's a free website or app for submitting biological records. And the sort of default data you need to collect is the date, the recorder, the species, and the location, but there are other boxes to add in more things. Please take lots of photos at different views. Even if it's sort of blurry, it might have some detail in that will be really helpful. So please just upload them and don't feel any sort of like shame that your photo isn't good enough. Without photos, it's really hard to verify the record. So that's something. I'm sure lots of you already use iRecord, so this might be quite a boring section for you, but for those of you that either never heard of it or you've tried it but you didn't love it, or you didn't understand it. I've had so many people send me records and go, I tried to use iRecord, but I can't do it. So I emailed me. That's absolutely fine, but I just wanted to go through just submitting a record on iRecord, just for those of you that don't know. So you do need to, if you're using the app, you need to download the app from the Google Play Store or your Apple Store, and then you have to sign up with your email and make an account. So there's a view of what I did when I put in iRecord. So you see I've already got it, so it says open, but that ordinarily would say install if you don't have it, and you click that button. So to submit a record, when you log in and you open up the app, you'll have this sort of view. You can see that I've been doing lots of short-necked oil beetle records and not a lot else, but that green circle down the bottom is your friend. If you press that, it will let you submit a record. So once you click that, it will come up with this sort of view, and then you put the species name in. There has been like a bit of problems with common names sometimes that I know, and people have said to me, I tried to put short-necked oil beetle in and it didn't come up with anything. So if you do know the Latin, that can obviously help. But if not, just sort of let the species drop-down menu load in. It can take some time. So once you've done that, this is a sort of recording form that you get given. So add photos if you can, as I've said, and then you've got the species, the location. If you've got the location on your phone, then it'll automatically take you to where you're standing if you say you're doing it out in the field. But if you're not, you can just go around the map and click a little pin. And then, yeah, date, abundance, so that's how many, stage. If you saw an adult oil beetle, for example, if you saw a violet oil beetle and you think it's a male because of the kinked antennae, you can put male in the sex. If you're ready to submit that record, please press the finish button on the top right. I know a lot of people that get confused at this sort of submitting, or they think if you haven't finished, that's absolutely fine. If you click the back button, it'll save it as a draft, but otherwise click finish and then it'll be sent off. Otherwise, you can do it on the website. If you're not sort of an app person, absolutely no problem. So once you log into the website, you'll have this sort of view. And if you click record and then enter a casual record, that's for when you're sort of out and about and you've just seen one thing. You can click that and it'll come up with a very similar recording form to what you get in the app. So it'll look something like that. So to go a step further, I'm going to talk a bit about iRecord activities, which I actually didn't, despite being in conservation for a number of years, never used until this year. So they're a method of capturing biological records for specific organisations, sites or areas, using the iRecord forms. They're essentially a group. So the way that we're using it is for species-specific groups. So if you submit records without iRecord activities, it just goes into sort of the large database. But if you add an activity, it can go into one sort of group. So the National Oil Beetle Recording Scheme, sort of been launched by Buglife, does have an activity, and you can see it there. It's called Oil Beetle Survey 2023. And basically it makes it much easier to view sort of data that's relevant to you. So now I could click on that and get a nice map of loads of people that have just submitted oil beetles for the recording scheme. And it shows you can look at the records before they're accepted and verified, and you can look at photos and things. So I think it's brilliant. So if you do want to join an activity, you go to sort of that top view, top menu on the website. You have to join an activity via the website, I think. You click activities and it will take you to this page. And then you can click browse all activities, and it will give you a really long list of all the activities that exist on iRecord. So you can just scroll here and just add however much you want. Or you can search for a specific species or group that interests you. So you can see here I put in oil beetle, and these two things have come up, both of which are run by Buglife. So Oil Beetle Survey 2023 is the national scheme. So you could use that activity for any oil beetle records within the UK. And then the second group, which says short-necked oil beetle species on the edge, is a group that I've just set up specifically for myself and colleagues and some of my volunteers and just people I've chatted to that are specifically looking for short-necked oil beetle within the time frame of the project of the Species on the Edge programme. So that's from now till like 2027. But it just makes it way easier for me to keep track of the records as they come in, especially there's so many more sites for short-necked oil beetle, and it's great to just see them all in a map as they come in, rather than me having to sort of like hunt them down. So if you would like to join an activity, you click this little star, and then it will add it to your, it will add the activity to your account, and it will appear in the app. I'd recommend joining the ones that I've just named below. I've got a Caletes, a Northern Caletes one that's very similar to short-necked oil beetle, and they are just species specific, purely just so that I can all look at my data in the same place. So once you've added an activity on the website, you can go into the app, and you see that activities is a little section on the toolbar at the bottom of the app. And then you can click on that and it will come up with all the activities you've joined. If they're not there yet, just refresh the page. You can see that the national scheme isn't on my phone at the moment, but it just takes a little while to come in. So for example, if you're going out surveying just for short-necked oil beetles a day like I do, I can click that and then I get a little pop-up, that little blue pop-up in that middle photo that says any records you add from now on will be submitted to the chosen activity. And so that means every record I make will be automatically added to that group. So you can see in that red box in the final photo, when I click submit a record, that comes up and it says activity, short-necked oil beetle. If, for example, I'm out and about and I see a Moscarda bumblebee and I want to record it, I can click on that activity and set it back to default. So it is changeable, but just if you are doing species specific things, if you are going out just for oil beetles, you can join the national oil beetle recording scheme like activity, and then it will all just go in through there. As someone said in the chat, actually, so the Field Studies Council YouTube has loads of really good iRecord tutorial videos. Thank you for putting that in. iRecord themselves have quite a lot of good resources as well. I know in the past have just gone, I've attended some iRecord training and then I've gone, oh, I have no idea what to do, and that I've just left it there. But iRecord, I like in particular their video guides. So if you go onto their website and go under the sort of help bar, the third option is iRecord video guides, and they've got loads of little videos, and they links like YouTube videos about the really sort of simple stuff that I used to get confused about, like submitting records. So if you just need a refresher, you can watch a video that's literally 2 minutes long that will like take you through every step, and you can like pause it and have a look. Yeah, see what they do as you do it at the same time. So I think that's really, really useful. If you decide you hate iRecord, or it doesn't work for you, or you don't have a phone or whatever, that's absolutely fine. There are other ways to submit records. So you can contact your local biological records centre with your sighting. So here's a little list of some Scotland ones, but other biological record centres are available. You can email me. So there's my email. I will send this around at the end again. But if you are going to email me any of your records, please make sure it's got the sort of default data that I want. So suspected species, if you just think it's an oil beetle, but you don't know what, that's absolutely fine. Date, location, sort of brief description of where you found it, so habitat. Please feel free to like add more data to this, such as like if it was feeding on a particular flower or plant at the time, please let me know. And then there's any sort of photographs to help confirm your identification. So here's a sort of guide for taking photos of oil beetles. While most of the photos on the left-hand side are very nice, other than maybe the blurry one, they're not very useful for ID. As I've said previously, that top-down view is really, really crucial for the thorax for pretty much every species. So you see this photo on the right, despite it being a blurry photo and it's not a good photo, is perfectly good enough for identification, and we can clearly see that sort of concave end to the thorax and that indentation depressed area. So that is a violet oil beetle. So just bear that in mind when you're taking photos. I do understand the oil beetles that got away and they don't have good enough photos and you can't ID them, but don't worry, it happens to the best of us. There's lots of resources that can help with identification. I will be sending this around as a sort of workshop resources thing at the end of this. So I'll send around these slides and I'll send around sort of a list of resources that you can use. So Stephen Falk has a great book on the field guide of bees of Britain and Ireland, and this does include solitary bees as well. But even more exceptional is his Flickr page, I think, which has loads of really high quality photos of, well, solitary bees, but also other bees as well. And they can be really useful if you're not really sure where to start and you just want to look at some nice photos of bees and then you see something that's similar, and that can be really useful. I know there's a good guide to solitary bees of Britain on the Wildlife Trust website by Ryan Clark. Alternatively, you could join a Facebook page if that's your thing. So if you join the Bees, Wasps and Ants recording pay group, and then you can upload your photos and say, I don't know what this is, help me. I'm sure people will be more than happy to help. And you don't need to know the exact species when you submit it to iRecord. You could just put, this is an oil beetle, this is a mellow spur, a mellow species, but you don't know. And then the verifiers will ID it if the photos allow them to. So here are some of the books that I was talking about. So Stephen Falk's book is on the right and is absolutely brilliant, but there is also some books specifically on solitary bees, such as this one by Ted Benton. And here's just Stephen Falk's Flickr. So it's just a quick screenshot of what it looks like. You can see he's got a folder for lots of different species of bee, and they're brilliant and they're really high quality and close up and different angles and all sorts of things that can help you when you're struggling. So all of this is to really promote my citizen science survey that I've got going on at the moment in Scotland specifically. If any of you are joining from England or Wales, please submit your records. We've still got the National Oil Beetle Recording Scheme going on, as we do every year. It's just because I'm based up in Scotland, I'm on a Scotland-based project, that this citizen science survey is Scotland-based. But it'd be absolutely brilliant to get some more records for oil beetles within Scotland, as we are sort of lacking in them compared to England and Wales. So just a quick reminder, back to oil beetles again, if you're unfamiliar. So large black beetles found in grasslands and heaths and coastal areas, March till early July or March till June. We've got 3 species. Any records you have, including, oh, I saw a really big black beetle last year and I never did anything with my photo. Please submit your record, even if you think you've forgotten some of the information about it. It's just really useful, and a lot of sort of data gets lost in this way. And our website has a very good identification guide on it. So this is our web page for the Scottish oil beetle search. And you can sort of see on the right-hand side, we've got a sort of related links section where you can learn a bit more about oil beetles, the specific species, but also the national scheme, an ID guide, life cycle, a species management sheet, especially for habitat management. And here's the just a screen grab of the ID guide that we've got on there. So it does all 5 UK species and talks about the sort of differences in identification of all of them. And it's just incredibly useful. And I've still found myself looking back at it over the years as well, which, yeah, so it's just a really useful guide. So now I'm going to do a little bit of a test for everyone. If you just want to put your answer in the chat of what oil beetle you think this is, that would be absolutely fantastic. Just a little spoiler, these are only Scottish species. So is this a short-necked oil beetle, or a black oil beetle, or a violet oil beetle? Please just put in the chat now. Give you a few seconds to get your answers in. So I'm seeing lots of positive answers. Thank you very much. Yes, it is a violet oil beetle. So you can really clearly see this concave base to the thorax. This little tooth is much less obvious from these sort of back views, but that is so in focus that it's clearly concave there, and you've got that depressed area. So that sort of lighting is absolutely perfect. Sometimes you can't really see if the angle's slightly different. You can't clearly see the angle of the end of the thorax. So here's your second oil beetle. This is an outstanding photo for identification purposes, so take notes. It's really good, though I know personally I don't have a good enough camera to take a photo like this, so don't worry. But yeah, if you want to put anything in the chat about what oil beetle this is. That looked great. Yes, Hayley, you're right. Don't say black, I think. Say it's a black oil beetle and I'm confident. Yeah, we've got that really straight base to the thorax, and there's that complete lack of tooth there. There's no indentation, there's no gap there at all. And this is a female because the antennae aren't too kinked either. Here's another one, a bit more of a fuzzy photo. Also on those sunny days, it is really difficult to get that sort of definition of the wing cases and the abdomen. So it's quite hard to get good photos of oil beetles, but all we need is a good photo of the thorax. And you're all completely correct. It is a short-necked oil beetle. Absolutely gorgeous things. I love them. So as well as this rectangular thorax that is quite clear that it's rectangular, not square from here, the antennae, they're completely different. They're short, they're straight, they're clubbed, and they're not sort of kinked like violet or black oil beetle antennae are. And here is your final one. He's a bit of a beast, this one, absolutely huge. I haven't said so far in my presentation, but their size is actually variable on how much they ate as a beetle larvae. So this one did very, very well as a beetle larvae, but you will find smaller oil beetles out there, and some of them are full size. They just haven't done quite as well, so the size does vary. So come on, a few more answers coming in now. So yeah, this is another violet oil beetle. So this is a sort of different view. You can still see that tooth is incredibly hard to work out. I think it's a good identification feature in the right sort of photos, but really this sort of base to the thorax is the most useful one. So quickly, I'll just say for any of you based in Scotland near the coast and islands, if you do want to help out me or any other of my colleagues with surveying, please just pop me an email. You don't need any experience, training will be provided. If you're already collecting this data anyway for yourself, just feel free to keep me in the loop. It's absolutely great to hear about what other people are doing, especially if people are learning about new populations or new sites or unlikely habitats or feeding habits or potential host species. Yeah, everything is incredibly useful. Bear in mind there are, 37 other species, 35 other species, I suppose, on this project. So if you're interested in things other than oil beetles and Northern Colites specifically, there is still help needed. Alternatively, please don't feel the need, especially if you're not based in the area. There is still an awful lot of data that we need outside Scottish coast and islands, including England and Wales, if you have joined us from across the border. So please don't let it deter you from just sending in casual records to iRecord, especially via the activities that I've talked about. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's been absolutely brilliant to see the sheer numbers of people turning up. It's a really great thing that people are getting really involved with oil beetles, especially for finding out what those host species are. I want everyone out looking for triangulans. Yeah, the more data, the better. So yeah, we've got some time for a few more questions. I think before that ID case, perhaps there were. Oh no, there we go. So we don't have any more questions from the last break, but if you do, can't think of any more, either just take yourself off mute and ask them now or put them in the chat. Yeah. So if there aren't any questions, or if you just think of one later, feel free to email me. And as I've said, I'll send around these slides and some extra resources to help you. Thank you so much for coming once again. It's just great to have people involved, really. And please feel free to search a bit more about Species on the Edge if you're based in Scotland, as we've got an awful lot going on and an awful lot of opportunities. So yes, thank you very much, everyone. It's been great.